When Buddha was asked to describe his teachings, he stated simply, I teach suffering and the end to suffering. I imagine that was probably fairly underwhelming for anyone who traveled a long distance to hear him speak. After all, there were other teachers that stated that they spoke to deities, that they were sent by a higher power. They cast spells, they cast out demons. What good is it to teach suffering and the end of suffering? However, when we stop to think about it, the teaching is actually quite profound. The fact is, suffering is one of the few things that are universal, not just to the human experience, but to all sentient beings. More than that, we as humans, and I can attest to this, have an almost innate ability to make ourselves suffer unnecessarily. Thus, what the Buddha was actually stating in those simple words was that not only could he teach us the cause of this universal curse of suffering, but he could teach us the cure. Now, it turns out we as humans create suffering for ourselves in almost innumerable ways. But he summed it up by stating that suffering is caused by desire, and the way to end suffering is to end desire. Now, this is a little bit tricky because obviously we can't live if we have no desires. It would be a tough trick to not desire to eat food when we were hungry, not desire to sleep when we're tired. And what I've found that it isn't desire necessarily that's the problem. It's desiring the wrong things. More specifically, not understanding the difference between the things that provide pleasure and the things that provide happiness. Desiring things that create pleasure not always, but sometimes leads to unnecessary suffering in the long run. On the flip side, desiring things that create happiness oftentimes will create some suffering in the short term, but creates happiness and contentment in the long run. As an example, I find that a lot of the work I do here on the homestead, frankly, isn't very pleasurable. Recently, I was walking through my basement and just knocking cobwebs out of the floor joist with the broom. It was gross and disgusting. I'm pretty sure I swallowed more than a few spiders, and I cannot understand how the basement gets so dirty, gets so many cobwebs in such a short amount of time. It's not pleasurable at all. But it is a source of happiness because after I deal with the short-term suffering of swiping cobwebs and getting them in my face and on my clothes, there is the long-term happiness and contentment that comes with not having to look at any cobwebs. Another example can be found in feeding and watering my animals. It's pretty cold where I am right now. There's lots of snow on the ground, lots of ice. Going out to do my morning and evening chores, frankly, can be a bit treacherous. I've fallen a couple times and wondered if I'd hurt myself seriously. It's not pleasurable. Even when I wear all the layers, all the warm clothing that's supposed to help, somehow the wind still finds a way to find bare skin, and I'm cold. Sometimes as I'm changing out the water for the chickens, some of it splashes on me. And once again, I'm cold. I'm also what? Not pleasurable. But doing my daily chores allows me the long-term happiness and contentment that comes with having happy, safe animals. The chickens provide eggs in the summer. The rabbits provide fertilizer all year in the way of their manure for the garden. If I'm willing to deal with the short-term suffering, then I have the long-term happiness. But if I instead chose to chase pleasure, if I instead chose to stay inside when it was cold and let my animals fend for themselves, the results would be disastrous. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not stating that pleasure is in and of itself bad, or that it is wrong for us to desire pleasure necessarily. I find it very pleasurable to sit down with a cup of tea in the evening and read a book. I find it very pleasurable to cuddle with the cat. No suffering associated with those things. The key, however, is to look at the sources of pleasure that we're chasing after and take a moment to think about the long-term consequences. Oftentimes, what happens for us as people is as our minds get filled with our desires and we start chasing after them, we lose track of those long-term consequences, or we think that it won't be that bad. We think, that'll happen to other people, but it won't happen to me. And as a result, our desires cause us harm. More than that, oftentimes, they cause harm to other people. And thus we find ourselves trapped in the endless loop of suffering. We chase our desires are pleasurable, but they don't bring long-term happiness. So we chase our desires even more. And we suffer more. So we desire more. And thus we're unhappy and we can't figure out why. But if we're willing to ask ourselves the question, what is the long-term result of chasing this desire? Will it be short-term pleasure and long-term pain, or short-term pain and long-term happiness? If we can ask ourselves that question and be honest with the answer, we'll find that we're able to end suffering, understand suffering, remove suffering for ourselves and for others. Amitabha.